Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for venturing out in this rain and being here. It's really a wonderful evening. I'm very happy that Iñaki is going to speak to us, so it's going to be a wonderful evening. I think everyone probably knows that there is a tradition here at the GSD that we have had the very well-known Walter Gropius lectures, lectures that have been delivered by chairs of the Department of Architecture upon the completion of their term as chair, which is part of this series in honor of Walter Gropius, who became the chair of the department in 1937. And of course, we're delighted that Iñaki will be giving the chair the talk tonight. The Department of Architecture and the GSD, I think, is particularly lucky that there have been a few occasions over the last few years where we have had the chance to have a lot of the recent chairs of the department here together. And we have at the moment, as part of the GSD community, no less than 9 chairs that really remain connected with the school. This is a very big deal. It's a really important thing for an institution to have 9 chairs that are in some way or other involved with the school. They include Jerry McHugh, who was the chair and then the dean of the school, Harry Cobb, Rafael Moneo, Max Coggin, Jorge Silvetti, Toshiko Mori, Scott Cohen, Iñaki Abalos, and of course now Michael Hayes. When we think about Spain, where Iñaki comes from, and we think about the experiences that we've had here at the GSD, and sort of thinking about the recent history of Spanish architecture, a lot of time in the 1980s and 1990s, the kind of thought of Spanish architecture is about a particular kind of architecture which is really linked to very well-made buildings that are very well considered. They are very careful about their thoughts in relation to context, and many of these were also brought to our attention under the general rubric of critical regionalism. But I think at some point, also in the late 80s and 90s, we managed to, and we were lucky to come across a practice called Ábalos and Herreros. And this is a practice that Iñaki and his then partner, Juan Herreros, started in the 1980s. And I think unlike many of the other practices in Spain that were very serious, very dedicated to particular understanding of tectonics, this was a practice that was very witty. They were really quite naughty. They were involved in play, in consideration of chance, in questions of temporality, and in many respects quite different than what was going on at the time. The discussion of technique, for example, was an important part of the conversations of this particular practice. For me, both Iñaki and Juan, in some ways linked probably more to an earlier generation of Spanish practice, and he'll correct me. I'm not an expert on Spanish architecture, but I think it links to an earlier generation of Spanish architecture. People like Alejandro de la Sota, Oiza, and Miguel Fisac. I think those are three architects that, for me, have the closest connection, probably, to the work of Iñaki Abalos. I was lucky that we could collaborate together on a publication on Alejandro de la Sota. We had the intention to also make a book together on Oiza, which we never did. I wish we had. And then Iñaki and I got to see some of the work of Fisac together, and I was lucky to be able to write something on Fisac. And I think Fisac, in some ways, is probably the closest in terms of what a contemporary what Iñaki for me represents in terms of a kind of contemporary version of Fisac. For those of you who are not familiar with the work of Miguel Fisac, Fisac represents an architecture that is full of plasticity, of sensuality, of materials, of form, but also has an incredibly deep understanding of technical know-how of how to put the building together, how to make it. His famous building, the pagoda, which is really the kind of rotating floors of a building, and many other projects where really the kind of the construction of the building becomes such an important part of the creation of a certain set of affects or emotions connected to the building, represent some of the kind of qualities that I think Iñaki is very much interested in. Matt, is everything all right? Good. Okay, just checking that I'm doing something wrong. The work of Avalos and Herreros was always combining an interest in architectural design also together with the production of ideas and theories in terms of writing. An important monograph was the monograph from 1997, Areas of Impunity, where, for example, it was very clear that this was a practice that was as much interested in the idea of in ideas related to kind of rethinking, for example, the concept of phasing in architecture, finding new ways, alternative ways in which the phenomenon of incompletion could be part of the consideration of a master plan in very unusual and different ways than, for example, what was then current in terms of phasing projects. A later book, which was then also translated from Spanish to English, The Tower and Office, from Modernist Theory to Contemporary Practice, was a very important publication in terms of the discussion of the role of technique. But anyway, sadly, Iñaki and Juan split up in the mid-2000s. And Iñaki was lucky to then be able to join together with Renata Sankovic, and they've had their practice since then. I was also lucky that both Iñaki and Juan got to teach, and we spent time together in London. And of course, then Iñaki became, in 2009, the Kenzo Tange professor here at the GSD. I think probably, Toshiko, you were the one who invited Iñaki, so thank you very much to you, Toshiko. And then, of course, more recently, the appointment of Iñaki at the GSD as the chair. I think the tenure of Iñaki here at the school has been full of interest, excitement. He's certainly been asking us lots and lots of questions about ways in which we do things, and has also pushed that idea through a series of conferences, symposia. I think obviously one of the hallmarks of his tenure will be the emphasis that he has placed on the issue of thermodynamics and how he really has tried to use that in order to transform both part of our pedagogy and research, but also part of his own practice. And I think that work is also consistent with some of the earlier writings that he was doing before he got really into thermodynamics, which were books like The Good Life, which I think contained some of the elements of the whole issue of the interior, the atmosphere, the life of the building. And so, in a way, it's also important to recognize that thermodynamics always promised and promises more than sustainability. That's really, it's about a kind of mode of thought, it's about a certain attitude towards life. And I think this is this kind of magical, emotional, and atmospheric dimension of architecture, together with its material and technical aspects, is something that's come to be the hallmark of both Renata and Iñaki's practice, but also of his teaching, pedagogy, and leadership here at the school. So I'm really grateful for everything that he's done, and I'm sure that there's going to be lots and lots of exciting things that he's going to put in front of us tonight. So please welcome Iñaki Ábalos.
Thank you, Moisan, for this intro. Thank you, Toshiko, for inviting me a long time ago. And thank you, everyone here, for being tonight with me. I don't know it's going to be too exciting, what I'm going to say. I mean, it's a little bit like, I have said everyone, it's a little bit boring, but I like it. But let's begin. To celebrate this ritual, I have chosen a subject of which I believe there is no one that can consider himself or herself an expert. A subject that is the central theme of the academic activity, and especially of the GSD and its Department of Architecture, that of the relationship between education, research, and professional practice. We always talk about this. I will use for this a curious and almost forgotten type, the medieval monastery, following its somehow paradoxical evolution throughout time until it's becoming into one of the typological formulations that I consider of most interest to an architect's education, and I have used a lot this type for studios and seminars, etc. The one commercially referred to as mixed use nowadays. That is, in my understanding, just a prototype in its childhood that has an enormous potential to combat the lack of quality and transform our metropolis. Many of the students in this room will soon be teachers in other schools across the world and will disseminate the ESD design culture abroad. My purpose today is to give them a testimony of the value of working on teaching and practice understood as a form of knowledge by showing some of my current interests, not as a demonstration of anything, but exposing myself. As many studio instructors do, I use Option Studios as a laboratory where I can test ideas, still in the process of becoming, giving the students an active role in identifying routes of exploring through their designs. Normally, this experience is translated in exhibitions, as the one that was opened a few days ago in Berlin with the last open studio, or into essays or articles which pose new questions, giving birth to new studios, and so on, like a circle. This year's Option Studio, Subjects, Forms, and Performances of the Contemporary Hybrid, is testing protocols of design based in exploring the lineage of the contemporary mixed use in historic types as the medieval monastery, as I have said, and its sequels in others like socialist phalansteries or the communist comunas. So this talk is in many ways its natural outcome. And why medieval monasteries? I mean, it's not something that I was all my life in love with. But these last years, I have been asked frequently by friends and colleagues about my life in Cambridge. And I always had the same response. I live now like a monk, cloister. My time discretized chronometrically between teaching, learning. I had to learn a lot, and I have learned a lot. Practicing, writing, meeting, and most of the time, emailing. Every single day of the week. It's a kind of banal response, I know, and as it is an experience that everyone has here, instructors and students. But the repetition of this response made me interested in how monks actually lived in medieval times. I mean, I had never thought about that. Which ones were their motivations, routines, and their organizations in architectural terms? What can I learn from them? So only these last years, as I said, I began to be interested in the Cistercian and the Carthusian monastery typology, possibly because the immaculate, I have to say this word, immaculate type of the Gothic cathedral had, as for many others, obscured in my mind this other essential type of the medieval times. A type, the monastery, that was seminal in producing much of what we know now, frankly, I mean, and transmitting knowledge and paving the path of what we know as our universities. Let me show, to begin with, I mean, to enter in the topic, with these engravings and drawings representing the whole context of the monastery type. And not only what we are used to seeing, which is their monumental core, the church, the cloister, etc. These drawings representing all the monasteries' context impressed me because in them I understood that their success in time and their productive culture was based in the land they owned, not in the architectural, not exclusively in the architectural core. It allowed them not only to survive, but to interact with the villages around and the village through an intense economic exchange of goods, promoting the local markets and therefore the economy of the villages, and giving way through bigger and bigger exchanges to a new territorial organization that opened the door to the Renaissance territory and the Renaissance culture. Another engraving, you will see some of them. I hope that you distinguish the title of, if you want, and they are more or less chronologically ordered. In some, they stop looking to me like what we call now in ecological terms closed systems, because I discovered that in reality they operated as open systems. The spatial mechanism being the creation of a policy of circles of decreased privacy, pivoting around the church and the cloister. Followed by other circles that begin with the domestic domain of the converts. There are monks and converts, not dedicated to the contemplative life, but dealing as a labor force for agriculture, farming, hydrology, fork, producing bronze, tiles, glass, etc. That defined another circle occupying significant areas of land and surrounded by the last one, the forests that limit the property and that, being wild nature, provide heat resources. This policy of circles of privacy has remained since then the main organizational tool or technique of the different mixed-use types. In ecological terms, the monastery is, by no means the most successful mixed use of all them, in time and in space. In time because of its duration till nowadays, in reality. And in space because of its successful spreading throughout all the countries of Europe. This is only the Cluny monasteries. The Cistercian are much more expanded, but I didn't find the map. Becoming a unique contribution to the cultural and economic evolution of the medieval villages. Coming back in time, for years I was dedicated to exploring the potential of the mixed-use type in modernist and contemporary architecture. Moison has mentioned some of this work, remaining somehow blind to their interesting ancestors. In one of my first articles, I think it was signed with Juan, Hybrids, I collected a series of complex structures that began to construct a genealogy of the mixed use. This was published in the Arquitectura, the magazine of Madrid, the Colegio de Arquitectos of Madrid. I had a catalog, a kind of very, very improvised, beginning in the Romanesque auditorium of Sullivan in Chicago, that all of us know, and is a precious mixed use. And I follow with others till I also arrive into another Chicago piece, this impressive monolith of the John Hancock, other, like the gallery building in New York, that was also interesting. And continuing with some important unbuilt projects that every one of us know well, and I don't need to mention the authors, I think. And this one that is interesting, maybe less known, the Hans Koll of Atlampol, impressive. After that, in Tower Office, the book I published in English, thanks to the generosity of Michael Hayes, reviewing it, and when he didn't know me at all, by the way, and this was the main reason why it was published by MIT Press, so thanks. Maybe if you knew me, other thing would happen. I studied in detail the evolution of the ideals of modernist architects inspired by the Taylorist principles of division of work applied to the technical apparatus of the skyscraper. Programming one side, structure in other, facade in other, core, MEP, etc. Each part received by these architects a separate approach and treatment. And the post-World War II evolution actually demonstrated that the reality was very much the opposite. The parts contribute to the whole, merging systems and programs and contradicting the spatial and organizational logics of the monofunctional skyscraper. Making its design a new place where all the subsystems have to adapt, negotiate, and collaborate to subsist. These tables and examples represent a moment in this long process that happens in between an original experimental prototype and its typological consolidation, which is constructed by addressing the material culture of a given moment in time. I will come back to this idea later on. A significant part of my research has been dedicated to explain this prototype, the mixed use, as an embryo of a forthcoming, in my mind, metabolic entity, potentially very efficient in social, ecological, and thermodynamic terms, using my teaching and practice to experiment new design protocols that resist the most obvious cliches, confronting them with categories as monster beauty, dualisms, or thermal engines that I have used in many of the talks in this room, and that pretend to open new paths for its evolution. Revising now this article, Hybrids, 25 years ago, later, I see that the schemes less commercial and somehow visionary were the ones that captured more my attention, as the Homey Paris Library and its new formulation of the tower reversing its interior-exterior modernist relations, or the massive vertical orchestration of multiple typologies, private and public, in Kohlhoff's Atlan Pole. The first using intrusion as its main design technique, the intrusion of a picturesque extended version of the Le Corbusier promenade. The second, monumentalizing the silhouette of the mixed use as a massive sculptor. Just to remark a few that in my mind resonate with the title I borrow from Nietzsche for this lecture, Architecture for the Search for Knowledge, a title that belongs to the aphorism that appears with the number 280 in his book, The Gay Science, published in 1882. An aphorism I quoted, not by coincidence, in the three books that I consider more relevant in my career, Tower and Office with Juan, The Good Life, and Essays on Thermodynamics, Architecture and Beauty with Renata. So let's take a look to this aphorism. You can read while I drink. Let me read the last phrase. We wish to see ourselves translated into stone and plants. We want to take walks in ourselves when we stroll around these buildings and gardens. It's one of the few images, very strong images, architectural images that he used, and it's a very specific and very clearly directing a message to, I would say, all of us. This last phrase is an amazing architectural micro-manifest, almost impossible to resist in its beauty. No? It persuades you just because of its beauty. Believe me or not, I mean, throughout these years that I have quoted so much, I was unaware of how, I mean, I have to confess it, how much Nietzsche was thinking about a specific type, the monastery. I thought it was a kind of generic Gothic picturesque dream or something like that. Only now that monasteries have begun to be interesting for me, I can see that he writes the whole paragraph with a specific monastery in his mind. And before analyzing this text in detail, let me invite you to have an impression of the atmosphere of the monasteries, because I'm sure that some of you don't have a kind of whole picture of what I'm talking about. In their main spaces and rooms, strolling around their stones and gardens through a selection of images that, from different monasteries, chosen, I mean, it's very eclectic in time and typology, chosen to give you also a broad sense of their differences. So we can visit the chapter house, the place where monks and abbot read and commented the monastic rule almost every day, the rule that governs their life and that is organized in chapters, therefore chapter room. A cloister, this is a Benedictine monastery in Spain, a wonderful one, very, very old, it's Romanesque. Cloister where they wander around, alone and in silence or all together in a procession. Another view. the squaring of the cloister being a representation of the divine perfection in its length, height, width, and depth. Fountain, a very symbolic element, a very beautiful construction, always many times constructed or in the middle of the patio, providing life and purity. Refectory, where they eat all together but in silence or reading. The library, this is a recent image, where they study or copy books. The dormitory, sleeping together with the exception of the abbot. The church, where they sing the psalms. This is a Cistercian monastery, very old and not so rich as others, but very beautiful and very well preserved. And celebrate divinity. This is in Saint Etienne, in Benedictine. The chorus, the wood furniture down, the place reserved to the monks to celebrate the Mass. All these places are critical in their life. A kitchen, the thermodynamic center of the monastery, close to the refectory and the calefactory, warmed and used as a sitting room, especially for sick and elderly monks. Gardens where they enjoy their limited spare time. They didn't have that much time. Nietzsche's aphorism can be read as we see these images, as poetry. You know, they are poetry and they are philosophy in its most rhetorical state, not subject to any of the predicaments of the formal logic protocols. Aphorisms are essays or micro-essays that project ideas in their most intuitive state, solely searching for rhetoric persuasion. This is something that brings them close to the act of designing, which also consists on projecting in the physical sense, so projecting ideas, crystallizing forms, seeking to persuade of their appropriateness and importance, which is always impossible to demonstrate. To associate the architectural project to the essay brings together the spheres of philosophy and architecture, of space and time, as the beam and the underside of knowledge. It is therefore not surprising that philosophy always uses architectural metaphors and that architects need philosophical ideas. More importantly, we can see aphorisms as synthetic written forms that crystallize ideas, reactions, readings, discussions, that stay vague and dispersed, floating without focus, till the moment they find a synthetic presentation, the aphorism, and become articulated as a whole. Only after this form exists as provocation, a potential research can be developed. I am talking about the analogy among aphorism and projects because in my mind there is a central idea. As happens with aphorism, projects come first. They operate on us as revealing tools. There is not a neat cause-effect relationship between research and project. It is more true the other way. The project comes to us in all its complexity in a given moment, normally suddenly, and imposes its logic to all previous information that only have been warming up for this moment to happen. It's only after the project is in front of us that we can identify a research that needs to be articulated as such. Possibly I'm being too radical and projects don't come first alone. At least. They appear in front of us as if they were coming first due to their presentation as synthesis, as facts, but we have to admit that they actualize disordered ideas, conversations, the same thing that aphorisms, images, memories, readings, all of them suddenly crystallize in a completely new format. So new that reconnects all that was informal and chaotic, nonsense, in just the opposite, pure order and form. And this idea has consequences in the way we might conceive the respective roles and moments of design and research. Coming back to Nietzsche, he begins his aphorisms with two obvious rhetorical devices. A future that he visualizes one day and probably soon, and an us, a we, that presupposes and wishes to involve the reader, anticipating an audience. If we accept to become part of his audience, we will believe that architecture produces knowledge or that it should produce it. And we will want to know what is lacking in our big cities. It is in those questions that we are captured. Nietzsche continues by saying, that the time is past when the church possessed a monopoly on reflection, when the vita contemplativa always had to be first of all vita religiosa. And as impious, I'm synthesizing, godless, could not have access to the knowledge in its constructions. We wish to see ourselves translated into stones and plants, etc. And that is where Nietzsche takes us, to an affirmation that we can all understand, but that makes of the model of the monastery a counter-model. He doesn't want to think, he cannot think in a monastery. The paradoxical behind Nietzsche's aphorism and the architectural image is that the architectural image is used not as a model, but as a counter-model. What we don't want, but of what we don't have an alternative model. We can't talk about it with another language or through other forms, since they don't exist. But at the same time, they are desired, they are necessary. We want the monastery and we don't want it. So perhaps it's the moment to ask ourselves, how were these architectures for the search for a divine knowledge organized? Originally, I mean, I'm going very quickly through, I don't know, 8 centuries. Originally by isolating themselves completely from the world, to live in grottos as hermits, and evolving very slowly to a cenobitic organization in forms that took centuries to consolidate. A bit of etymology about these words that shows the dual character of the monastery. Living alone, but having at the same time a common life. It's a kind of this is a real dualism. This is a very serious dualism. We see here some of these moments when the monasteries retire to the desert. This is in Mount Sinai, 6th century. It's impressive, no? The solitude and the isolation and the materiality too, no? And the cloister taking form later as an essential representation of the cenobitic life. It's the place where that everyone gets together. And this beautiful triangular, strange, I would say improvised cloister is one of the predecessors of the rational square cloister that came later. A well-known moment of this evolution is dated in 820, when the plan of Sengal stands out. A plan that was drawn by, I don't know how to pronounce, Aito, abbot of Reichenau, bishop of Basel, precisely Basel, the place where Nietzsche was writing the gay science. This is the first architectural plan that is known to us in Europe. It's really the first one that we have knowledge of. It was the plan for the organization of an ideal monastery, removed from the world and self-sufficient. In it, we should point out the square cloister. I mean, you can see it later on. Yeah. the square cloister attached to the church that organizes an interior for monastic life aside the church, normally in its southern orientation, taking advantage of solar radiation for the daily life of the monks. Without going into the controversies surrounding this document, there are a lot. I know the historians have a lot of, I don't want to enter into that. This is both, for me at least, this is both a diagram that discretizes the programs and an inventory of the parts that allow the monastery to survive in its relative cenobitic isolation. I mean, also, Sengal in particular was an important center of pilgrimage and political power, so I don't think it was so isolated. But anyway, as well as it is a first approximation to a topological or relational scheme in which the location and contiguity of the different programs responds to an efficient display on a flat and abstract site, only governed by the necessary east-west orientation of the church, which is in the center, and the cloisters, the cloister that, as the core of the monastery life, receives a more precise architectural definition in this drawing. The evolution of the prototype defined by this plan developed quickly between the 11th and 12th century, alongside the Benedict orders of Cluny and later on with the Cistercians of Saint Bernard. We can have a kind of, just in 100 years, no, less than 100 years, you see the rest of the first church in the cloister, in the second, and a dramatic change of scale that shows the success of the idea. No? Throughout these centuries, the overall form and material system of the monastery was perfected through the elaboration of a limited number of rooms gravitating around the cloister. I have mentioned them, the chapter room, the refectory, the kitchen, the dormitories, the latrines, the church, etc. Complemented by the way the position of each constructive component and each different room becomes fixed in the cloister, and the need of using natural resources as water, diverting itself back to meet the river that feeds them. You see that there are two flows of water there. The architectural type of the Cistercian monastery is in fact the result of St. Bernard's command to build near a river. That explains the position of the refectory, the latrines, and the kitchen. No? It's diverted to receive clean and dirty water. Water is important for different purposes, so it's channeled and organized into parallel waterways. One for drinking and cleaning, which gives origin to the fountain, etc. And another one for the water mills and to evacuate the waste that runs through the latrines and kitchen. Yeah. This evolution follows a process of adaptation to the life of the monks, looking for the highest formal abstraction as an expression of knowledge that corresponds with the abstraction of the spiritual life pursued by them. So we see here Fontenay, 12th century, Thoronet, a beautiful one that we will see images later, Eberbach, and then you see how they are constructing and repeating the model oriented to the north or to the south. Poblet in Catalonia, Spain. This is incredible. It's a pure abstraction. Morborn in Germany. And this is a kind of amazing construction. The Royaumont in France in the 13th century. I mean, I don't want to explain step by step this. I mean, there are many monographies. You can go to Wikipedia and you will learn everything about these rooms. This process from a prototype to a typology receives its definitive form in great part through the strong decision that supposes the exclusive use of one material. And this is very important. So all the process is perfection when they decide to construct in one material, stone. In that moment, apply only to cathedrals, fortifications, and palaces. And stone has we know its own stereotomic rules that govern the shape of each different element and each different room in systemic ways. The Cistercian monastery is a celebration of the stereotomic beauty in contrast to the ornamental character of Cluny monasteries that were much more about figuration. Some of them, such as the well-preserved monastery of Thoronet in France, are real manifestos of the power of abstraction in architectural forms. An abstraction that gives its character to the Cistercian monasteries, not anymore interested in these other fantasies, monsters, and all the stuff that you can see in the cloisters, Romanesque and Cluny monasteries. I remark all this to underline that typologies are not just diagrams or ideas in the way to become types instead of experimental prototypes. There is a process of finding their materiality and tuning it in tectonic, stereotomic, and thermodynamic terms, a process that gives its consistency and successful replication to the type. Typologies are not abstract ideas, or at least I think so. They are made of matter, are based in a material culture, and only succeed through a happy encounter of form, matter, and flow. This consistent unity we have here at table with this process. I like this slide. This consistent unity of the monastery and its infrastructure surrounded by auxiliary constructions, crops and forests generates a self-sufficient entity whose intrinsic beauty comes from being at the same time simple and complex. A machine for living, if I may borrow the words of Le Corbusier, or maybe more precisely a metabolic machine in which a small group of monks live under a series of precise, even mechanistic rules and codes. But what was the appeal that this was my main issue. No? What was the appeal that this invention had, that even the knights of the upper classes renounced to their sumptuous and also violent lives that they liked, no? War, etc., to their to the most instinctive pleasures they enjoy, to donate their goods and fortune and commit themselves to the monastic life, choosing isolation and poverty. The promise of happiness that contemplative life offers, identified at that time with the superiority of spiritual and religious life. This is the answer. And what is happiness in cenobitic life? To cite our own Christine Smith, that has been really helpful in preparing this, the greatest good, summum bonum, is union with God, partly experienced in this life and only fully realized in eternal life. Monasticism is the quest for union with God through prayer, penance, and separation from the world, pursued by men or women later on, sharing a communal life. This machine for living, therefore, stands as the typological materialization of the lifestyle of a new alternative subject in the medieval context, the monk, who, through his life and routines that you can see here, devotes himself completely to the discipline of the rule of the order he professes, which dictates millimetrically his daily schedule and activities, always identical to themselves, to itself. You can read, they woke up really soon. Every 3 hours visit the church, starting at 2 a.m. to sing the psalms. The slow rhythm of choral singing, and we might say of their life, adjusted to the large resonance chamber that the church is, at odds with the obsession against resonance we see nowadays in our performing centers, by the way. Other activities of the monks' schedule are meditating and praying, normally walking or staying around the cloister, reading sacred texts, or transcribing in the library the preserved Greek, Roman, Hebraic, or Arab books, which supposes a profound dimension of the utmost interest for the medieval and post-medieval organization of knowledge and pedagogy. This activity was amazing. This scheme, at the same time, protocol of life and of architecture, admits some variations. We don't have only Cistercians or Cluny, we have Carthusians, we have Franciscans, etc., etc. If San Benedict or San Bernard had given birth to the prototype of the Cistercian monastery, San Bruno, in the image, in parallel gave birth to the Carthusian monastery, another amazing invention, looking for a more radical way of vita religiosa, even more radical, I cannot believe it, increasing in this cenobitic life the hermit component by imposing to the monks total silence and maximum isolation, and this comes through dividing, instead of the common dormitory, having each one this interesting change of the collective dormitory for individual lodges with their own orchard, each one of them in the form of a patio, separated by 2 corridors to make it even bigger, the isolation. We have some images of, there are a lot of Carthusians now in Europe and in Latin America too. And all them surrounding a central garden space where the fountain is normally situated, I think the cemetery too. To sum up, the new subject, the rule and the type in their ecological context work as a mechanism in pursuit of an idea of happiness. Strange for us, but a very intense idea of happiness. The new subject, the rule and the type are the same thing, and the 3 of them are necessary at an organizational, economical, tectonic, and ecological level. These are other images of, incredible images of the Carthusian monasteries. Also, Le Corbusier was in love with this type, as you know, the Immeuble, Villa, etc., etc. I mean, a lot of references. And compose an architecture and a knowledge that contributed paradoxically to the outcome of a new world, but at odds with that of the monastery, the world of the Renaissance. All of this had almost disappeared in Nietzsche times. And Henri VIII dissolved monasticism in England in the late 1530s, beginning a process that expanded to the Lutheran countries along the 16th century, followed by the Catholic countries after the French Revolution. We can say that they again were restored, and now they are alive. There are a lot of them. We can say that this model had died of its own success, not only for having given birth to a new secularized and instructed class, but for having, in time, renounced to their own principles of poverty and isolation, in some cases going back to the city where they chased the power of the church and the prince and the king, making them appear as the very same thing. But also generating other sumptuous typological version, the monastery palace, El Escorial standing out as its first example built, widespread to other monarchies throughout the 16th and 17th century. This plan composes a complex program rigidly subject to the rules of symmetry with completely different activities, no? With the palace connected to the church in the top, in the axis, and the monastery cloister and the rest of dependencies of the monastery to the right, and the court rooms and other multiple activities as a school to the left side. I will not go into the sociopolitical implications of this typology. I will just mention I would say, the indisputable interest of this new format of the monastery palace as a typological invention. I think this beautiful image is a German monastery. It's a monstrous hybrid and a third version of the mixed use, but also a typology that will give way to surprising new formulation in the first decades of the 19th century, when palaces and monasteries became references of the revolutionary ideas of the social condenser and the campus university that the French and the American revolutions propelled. Let's compare now these two sequels of the monastery in this revolutionary period, comparing the contributions of Thomas Jefferson and Charles Fourier. Between 1819 and 1826, Thomas Jefferson, whose architectural skills are without a doubt, designed and built the University of Virginia, mostly all of you know, a structure devoted to a secularized contemplative life in search of knowledge, of which we all know its success and reproduction throughout the US and the world, for example here in Harvard. Jefferson proposed a well-known distribution of pavilions around a central lawn, headed by a building that contains the most symbolic collective activities and leaving its other extreme open towards the natural landscape, unfortunately enclosed nowadays by new buildings, which is a pity. It is impossible not to relate this typological scheme to the variation that we have seen, the monastery type elaborated by the Carthusians, in which each monk had its own house and orchard, and in which all the composition becomes sponged around a central courtyard or garden, headed by the church and further surrounded by a series of minor patios. I'm not aware of whether Jefferson, I was asking and no one was able to respond me, whether Jefferson ever alluded to this typological similitude between the two models, or if he had visited in France any Carthusian monastery. What I'm interested in is in its formal and functional analogies. Formally, while the typological scheme is maintained, its Gothic language disappears in favor of the Palladian secularized language, then meaning enlightenment, a new civil culture. Functionally, Jefferson reproduces the isolation of the monks in this model, with pavilions dedicated to each specific discipline, and a professor living in the upper floor, teaching this matter in the lower rooms, while the students, as the new converts, were located in the perimeter, close but separated of the inner ring. It's not a secret that American universities have inherited the model of the medieval monastery, even today in multiple aspects related to our rule life, from the language of academic hierarchies, provost, dean, chair, lecturer, all those come from, all to the way to the regalia that we wear during commencement, or the tight class schedule that organizes millimetrically our day-to-day. So no one of these routines that I have been talking about as strange are foreign to us and to our daily lives, both of professors as monks and students as converts dedicated to a secularized knowledge. In his excellent book, The Pedagogic Evolution in France, published in 1939 by Émile Durkheim, he concludes, "It is a notorious fact that among all the medieval institutions, universities remain today being the closest to their original formulation." I just mentioned this to frame the close relationship of this lecture with all of us. somehow subjects and objects at the same time of it. So the European idea of the phalanstery is firmly rooted in the ideas of utopian socialism, reacting towards the impact that the modes of industrial production had in the quality of life of the working class, and also against the bourgeois style of life, completely indifferent to a situation that demanded changes. Charles Fourier, as many other social critics, saw this situation as an opportunity to propose a radically new subject, as well as a new prototype, the phalanstery, whose name clearly alludes to its lineage. Fusion of phalanx, troop or army, phalange, and monastery. We are, by the way, in 1822, contemporary to Jefferson's scheme and 6 decades before the Gay Science was published. The phalanstery means an alternative to the modes of production, promoting the organization of the whole structure as a cooperative. It's a new idea. No? And to the family unit, permitted but not needed or promoted. For Fourier, just as for the Benedictine monks, happiness was at the core of his proposal. This time it was an earthly happiness, and a happiness for all, both collective and individual, based in a better organization of labor forces and their time, freed for cultivating culture, but also passions and instinctive life. Their frustration considered the cause of all problems. It's a kind of pre-psychological idea. This vision, for the first time in this lineage, includes women inequally to men. The invention of the term feminism is actually attributed to Fourier. And fueled libertarian anarchist theories, serving as inspiration for different attempts to materialize the phalanstery, all the way to the hippies communities of the 60s. The phalanstery means an alternative to the modes of production, promoting the organization of the whole structure as a cooperative, and to the family unit, permitted but not needed or promoted. For Fourier, just as for the Benedict monks, happiness was at the core of this idea. Sorry, I was repeating. But we should not fool ourselves. The phalanstery materialized a way of life just as rule and millimetrically organized as the most structure of the medieval rules and orders, of which it actually copies many of its guidelines, including, some way surprisingly, the organization in 2 social classes, just like the medieval monks and the converts did, divided for their different social status. You can see that the organization is really obsessive. Fourier proposes a community of around 1,600 inhabitants, a lot of people. No? The symmetry of the overall composition actually hides a highly organized spatial zoning, with kids occupying lateral wings, educated in libertarian ideals, the kitchen and the refectory socialized, and the center of the composition again dedicated to art and knowledge, as in Thomas Jefferson's scheme. And the agricultural and industrial programs are outside in front of the phalanstery in a composition that could be seen as a new Sangal plan, although the phalanstery to a large extent follows the aforementioned tendency that associate monastic and palatial life in huge structures. Now the king substituted by individuals that aspire to a social happiness that melts work and passions. Strange combination. There is also the utopia of a full control environment, a utopia that is the expression of the contemporary development of hothouse, greenhouses, and stoves. So at the beginning of the 19th century, we see 2 different paths in the evolution of the monastery typology, the mixed use. Its replication as a model for the revolutionary universities emphasizes the knowledge component and the isolation of the cenobitic life, while the European social condenser focuses in the organization of alternative communities in search of a productive ecological and psychological success, individual and collective. This second trend finds its materialization in the Red Vienna with the construction of the Karl Marx Hof, but 1 century after that, I mean, after the ideas of Fourier. It's a grandiose, that we all know, structure measuring 1 kilometer long, dedicated to massive social housing organized around a series of courtyards divided with maternity clinics, health insurance offices, laundries, kindergartens, up to about 25 different amenities that compose an exuberant demonstration of the power of the working class, occasionally used more as a fortress than as a palace when the Nazis were occupying the city. But the social condenser gave its more interesting examples after the Russian Revolution, no doubt. Radical ideas of labor communes and an egalitarian society governed neither the family unit nor by the divine order, produced some built examples like the Narkomfin building of Ginsburg and Milinis, well known, or the Textile Institute of Ivan Nikolaev, in which the factory becomes the equivalent of the church in monastic typologies. It's another incredible type. Not surprisingly, the rule of the communist social condenser, the comuna, becomes again an essential part of its typological definition. Similarly to the rules of monastic life, and this is a kind of mantra in this lecture, life in the comuna is chronometric, in this case driven by the fetishism of industrial production and by the adoption of Taylorist ideas in its time decomposition into minimum units that arrive to 2 or 3 minutes, which is schizophrenic, I would say. No? The new comuna subject, with his/her family given to the state and realized individually through his/her dedication to a mechanized work, will find a collective happiness in this world, but in a promised future that depends on his/her efficient work in the present and on the state planning. This idea, wherever we think about it, found its ounce and gall plan in the magnificent project for the communal house designed by Mikhail Brarts and Vladimir Vladimirov in 1929. Its 2 linear buildings, curiously composed in a cross shape, divide the 200 meters by 200 meters block in 4 open patios. The crossing of these extremely thin volumes, result of the yearning for light and ventilation, divides the program in a north-south residential part composed by individual cells of 9 square meters each, a collective refectory as well as other services in the ground floor. And this thin spine is crisscrossed by the other east-west linear structure that provides schools for the kids in the left side, west orientation, and programs dedicated to the leisure time and re-education of the worker in the other. The fetishism of the assembly line is not only present in the extreme thinness of the slabs, it reaches its paroxysm in the refectory. You see the image in the center, in which a mechanized system for the distribution of plates, similar to the travelator used in Japanese restaurants today, you see the arrow of the movement, reinforces its linear organization. I have to say that the beauty of this stylized project and its faith in the rule, type, material, culture, protocol, adapted to the idea of a communist happiness, shows us almost a caricature of modern times. Charlotte's title borrowed here. Symptomatic of the volatile condition of our time, and in particular of the political agendas of the 20th century, with experiments that would have interested little or very little to Nietzsche, whose belief in the construction of a new individual, the Superman, was far removed from a socialized understanding of education and much closer to an individualistic conception centered on the interior struggles of a contemplative life. We can connect here with the table I propose in Tower Office once again, and that paid attention exclusively to the other mode of social condenser, the capitalist mixed use, a product in many ways of the Cold War, ruled by benefits, consumerism, and technological exhibition, and organized in vertical strata to minimize land values repercussion. Its verticality, substantial with the type, demands a new design technique based in organizing the section instead of the plan as an adjustment of the gradients of privacy between the flows of people in the street and the demand of maximum insulation in the residential units located in the top. To define the subject and the rules of this version, we have to follow the flows of international capital investment and the flows of real estate data, painting with precision the portrait of its postmodernist character, not the Superman anymore, but the super affluent or the super rich, secluded in his/her golden tower in gigantic cells fortified against any kind of otherness, as J.G. Ballard explained in his novel High Rise of 1975, now transformed in a curious and interesting film. An idea that has its sound Senegal in the New York City Waldorf Astoria, finished in 1931, as its more interesting outcome. The refined residential hotel as the capitalist alternative version of the Comuna. But this is not the whole truth. Today, and by the hand of well-known architects, Omey, Big, Herzog and de Meuron, and some other, there are approaches that experiment with interesting results, the potential inherent to this type, pursuing a conceptual reformulation of its social, urban, and methodological implications. We have some examples here that I have used also as monsters that explain the interest of these new types. This beautiful building finished a very few weeks ago. In all cases, we see the organizational emphasis transferred to the section. In our own office, ACE Plus has contributed to this research and is dealing now with works that explore new urban and material complexes, presented very recently in this room in the context of the Heliomorphisms conference, so I'm not repeating myself, I'm just showing. This is a university campus, by the way, in Paris, another university campus in Weihai. As a professor at the GSD, I have proposed the students protocols that speculate with the vertical mixed use, applying design techniques that introduce basic thermodynamic principles, splitting into the design process. A first phase where the organization of the project focuses exclusively in conceiving them as thermal engines, using program as a combination of heat sources and sinks, and working with the equation for matter flow to manage climate, material, and sociocultural specificities. This moment produces what we call monsters, that are essentially aphoristic, if to use the language of this lecture, provocations that help to forget clichés and open the door to a second phase with the focus transfer to the students that need to identify individual researchers to confront critically the inconsistencies, redundancies, and excess of the first phase. Some different examples. This part of the exhibition in Berlin, as this one too. Beautiful, floating, golden globe. So to close, I'm closing, be quiet. Where are we in this tale about the long lineage of the medieval monasteries conducted by Nietzsche as our master of ceremonies? What do we know? Honestly, it's very difficult to say, and first of all, it's very difficult to use the rhetorical we to respond to this question. Although this is not a historical or political lecture, I think it's obvious, I am interested in the ideological differences and the methodological similarities of the mixed-use lineage a long time. This is under the rule and all these obsessions, the fixed in the description of the subject and the definition of the millimetrically of the life of each one. They all appear as countermodels of their predecessors. The monastery, the phalanstery, the campus, the comuna, the capitalist mixed use, all reverse their main purposes of the previous, but contain similar outcomes and methods that reveal a trend. I would say that Nietzsche was right. We can learn from them if we understand them as countermodels. I see beauty in the search for knowledge of all them. I say that. They are about innovation, type and prototype, new ways of life, I would say technologies of the self, material culture, technology, knowledge, and they produce drawings, lots of beautiful drawings. But I do not see their beauty as something I or we can feel comfortable with. It is there that I conclude my lecture, without neat conclusions, leaving them as a choice up to each of you, like a French film of the 60s or 70s that ends like open, with a deep gratefulness for having let me serve as the chair of the Department of Architecture for these past years, and for still being tied to a school that is faithful to the university principles of dedication towards knowledge and respectful towards the individuality and diversity of each one of us, teachers and students, monks and converts. Thank you very much. Thank you. Done.
I mean, you're all so positive and it's so wonderful. I don't know whether it's just good to end with a clap, or I think we should probably have a moment for some questions. I think there's so many moments of provocation, and that I think it would be great if there are some questions that you would like to ask. Maybe I can just start with a simple query. No, it would be very simple. No, I promise. No, I think at the beginning, it would be, it's very interesting, the interrelationship between Nietzsche and the kind of the aphorism and the kind of the statement of Nietzsche, and then the history of the monasteries. And while you're going through that, like 3/4 of the talk, there's a very clear relationship between sort of spatial practice, the spaces, and the life of the monks. And even when you get to the point of the university, the sort of the parallel between university life, the life of study, and so on is very kind of consistent. As we start coming more towards contemporary practice with the idea of the monster, at least to me, the concept of life is more ambiguous because it's not as clear as the practice of the monks. And so I am very interested in what happens. What is now the relationship between the spatial and the life that is, for example, suggested, insinuated by the monster? Is there a moment at which there is some kind of a disjunction that happens, that kind of coherence, that sort of consistency of monastic life is disappearing? Are you proposing a new kind of good life? What is the relationship between architecture and life in this latter part, in the last kind of 10 minutes of the lecture?
Well, it's not simple. I knew it was not going to be simple. This is the first response. I agree with you that apparently this idea of dissolves itself. I don't think it's dissolved, by the way. I think that is unformulated. I think that we live as monks, not we students, everyone. I mean, we are under many powers that control our life in ways that we don't perceive so well. I mean, there's a lot of philosophical and critical, social critics on the way we live nowadays. No? So I think that not being formulated doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. I think it exists in a more perverse way. This is the first response I have. For me, the second comment that I cannot invent. I cannot invent or generalize, or I don't even pretend that this is possible nowadays. But I think that is interesting to pay attention to this. I mean, these people are really, as the Greeks, by the way, is not. I mean, this comes from the Greeks. I mean, this comes from Aristotle, and so Pythagorean people. So it existed previously. You know, this idea, there's a moment that in philosophy and in the practice of life, there were two ways to work with yourself. Know yourself was one thing, that was the logo, the motto that the church took and created the monasteries, etc. And there's the other one is take care of yourself. Which is the one that, for example, Foucault in Technologies of the Self insists that is a tradition that we have lost through the religious tradition, and that in a way he was much more interested in how this other thing is happening nowadays, and how much it is repressed by many of the systems that control our everyday life. No? So I think that my interest in, I mean, the studio is subjects, it begins with subjects. My interest is to rescue, in a way, the discussion on the subject, who we are, I mean, which are the people that we want to really give a kind of interesting quality of life. What is quality of life for us? I mean, I would love to have a crystal ball and be the prophet of this new society. I'm not. I mean, for sure. But I think that posing the question and making it again an architectural question is relevant. And this is why I have bored you with all this talk. No? So the idea that it's not that something that we live like this. I mean, we can construct our lives. It's obvious. I mean, it comes from many traditions, and only through this constant we can construct an interesting architecture, and an architecture that can produce knowledge. No one knows what is knowledge, by the way, but everyone understands what it means. I don't know if I have responded.
Can I?
Yeah.
Jorge, just wait 1 second so that you can get the mic. Thanks.
No, I was, Moisen asked a question, and I was going to ask another one, and I
Can you speak to the
they
mic?
converge. First of all, let me say that if
It's okay.
thank you very much for this splendid lecture. And
Thanks.
if you consider this lecture boring, I'm glad you didn't give an entertaining lecture, because we'll be really exhausted. It was quite spectacular in the way you tie so many things together. But following up on what was just discussed, I was just wondering, and I think it converges with Moisen in a certain way, at what point that very, very important point you made at the beginning of the connection of this mode of life and this relationship to space, to architecture, that it was so tied to the productive landscape around is lost, and whether that may be as one of the explanations of what's Moisen asking, because it is obviously somehow, just by looking at the slides and what some of the footnotes were, it seems to me that in the 19th century, that begins to be lost, probably with industrialization and with the growth of population, I guess, when you begin to have larger communities. And obviously the skyscraper makes it almost, very, very vivid. I mean, suddenly the relationship to the land, it becomes something else.
Yeah.
So.
I want to just comment something on this, is that I think that the land is interesting in economic and ecologic terms, which are always the same, or at least etymologically. And I see, I mean, when I saw these engravings, and I thought, oh my God, these guys knew. I mean, they knew how to survive. No, it was very well organized. I immediately thought about all these pseudo green utopias of the green skyscraper, blah blah, that we have seen in these last decades. Now they are fading away, but 10 years ago they were rising. This is, you know, that things go like this in architectural terms. And I think I had always had a kind of interest in I have a archive with a lot of them, all very ugly, by the way. But I think that they were pointing to a good idea, but they were unable to organize them in vertical structures because the land. I mean, you can have some cultivation, some products, but I mean the kind of self-sufficient entity cannot. I mean, needs surface, no? And there are many calculations. And if you Google about green skyscrapers, there are many calculations that show the impossibility of having a self-sufficient city without counting with because of the density. I mean, and the need of expansion. I mean, there are, even with the hydroponics and everything like this. I mean, there is an impossibility of becoming green, if really green or ecologically green, and if you don't have a kind of expansion. But I think that idea of the let's say the mix of natural and artificial, architectural and let's say landscape or just farming features is still something that will need to be developed and will obtain some interesting developments in the near future. I think that the more that the conscience grows about the lack of resources, etc., the more the inventiveness will bring solutions to this. And I think that is a kind of interesting point. The monster, by the way, began being an interesting idea for me, just putting together these two ideas, a kind of elements that relate with the discipline of landscape and the elements that relate with the discipline of architecture, both of them fighting and trying to create a unity, but all of them organized vertically. Well, this is something that is some people. I remember MVRDV that made a beautiful in Hamburg, a beautiful gadget, I would say, but that was one of the best things that they have produced, probably because it was really provocative. There are some moments that you could see that there was a potential integration of this problem in the vertical construction, but this is still too far away, I think.
Any other?
John?
John? Maybe here in the front row.
Iñaki, I wonder if there was a moment in your genealogy where you, there seemed to be almost a split in the genealogy that you maybe unintentionally glossed over, and I wonder if you could expand on it, where there were the daily rituals and the daily routines of the monastery went from being primarily organized through communal spaces to one in which all of those communal activities were deeply atomized, and you emphasized even so far as a prohibition of speech and a vow of silence, right? Yeah. And it seems to me, picking up on Jorge's point and Moisen's point, that I wonder if if there isn't something in that connection, because obviously the most pronounced critique of the cell, of the concept of the cell in our contemporary discourse is from Sloterdijk, right, where he refers to it as a sort of form of co-isolation, and the modern condominium as a kind of expression of that. And I wonder if there isn't something in that, if there isn't something to be learned in the mixed-use model from that division that doesn't lead us back into sort of nostalgic models of communal living, maybe from the early 20th century. But maybe you could expand on that moment of almost privatization.
Again, in a very, let's say, practical term, I don't have a clear solution, but I see that the composition of small groups of people divided into groups, not by class, as in this case, but by other, like, for example, expertise or age, can really give way to communities that are more interesting than just those ones that are based in let's say, social class. There are many attempts, I think, in Europe are growing, I don't know, in the States, of communities that put together people, very young people, that are normally, let's say, leftists or green guys that are interested in having their farms, etc., in the city, and houses for the elderly. That create a kind of interesting combination and sharing things. I mean, the young ones have children that the others care when they go out. I mean, there is a kind of interesting possibility of creating new societies that are not that conventional and that produce, they can produce knowledge, they can produce a more intensity of life. No? And I'm interested in this kind of combinations of very two different things and see how they operate together. I don't have any other response. I mean, the whole idea of I like the idea of establishing attention among needing and wanting to share something and needing and wanting to be isolated. I think that this is radically modern. This is why this is why the monasteries survive, by the way. No, without going to other typologies, but this is why I see interest in this, even in the communist comuna, that in a way it frightens you a lot, but at the same time has a lot of sense. I mean, you are not alone. I mean, there are all the things are. I mean, you can really belong to something, but at the same time retain your individuality. I don't know.
Iñaki,
Hey,
thank
Silvia.
you. This was a wonderful, wonderful lecture. From your lecture, there's two things that maybe also associated with this question about land. One is a new understanding about pleasure. Pleasure as associated with being close to God, being close to a certain internalization. When we know that after the 19th century, particularly if we think about the pleasure grounds, that became part of the civic network of the city. So on one hand, the garden, the interior garden becomes the park, becomes a civic infrastructure. So there's an externalization of this interior world that becomes accessible to all. So I'm wondering how can we imagine pleasure being redefined or reinserted on this conversation? And second one is if the monster also becomes a way to engage the city, to engage the civic realm, in which you're not talking just about agricultural production, but actually about landscape as a civic network.
Well, I think that Giorgio Agamben is treating this topic now. There is an amazing book that is called Altissima Povertà, Highest Poverty, which is, I recommend everyone that is crazy with monasteries should read this. And I didn't want to enter into the Franciscans, but I think that in the Franciscans, I mean, in the idea of extreme poverty, it was not a kind of poetic hippie thing. It was based in the legal frame that still control the monasteries, and they wanted to become as animals, without any kind of. I mean, they had nothing. They were animals. I mean, so being like this, you were not a juridic person. You are just a life entity that is like an animal or a vegetal or whatever. And this was the technique. I mean, it's very crazy, but I think that they redefined the idea of a religious pleasure. They were really the ones that made an improvement in religion in the 15th, 16th century. Well, we now have a pope that is Franciscan, by the way. But this apart, I think that it's always. I mean, obviously you have all the sensual pleasures that all of us love, and me the first. I mean, but there is, I think that this is obvious. But I think that the idea that this talk has is this other way to think about pleasure, to be able to contrast this kind of, let's say, immediate pleasure understanding with one that is more elaborated and that produces the satisfaction, the care of yourself, again, that the Greeks were pursuing, and that Foucault insists that is something that we have missed. I think that this is, I mean, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not anything. I mean, I'm just someone that is, I am an aficionado of many things. But I think that this is the path where, I mean, it's more, I mean, this can be a kind of personal confession, no? But I think this is the moment when you feel that you are doing what you wanted to do, and you studied to do, and it produces an immense pleasure. And it doesn't happen every day, by the way. It happens very few moments, but I think the intensity is much more important than other intensities. This is something that, in a way, responds partially. And the other thing is the monster. The monster is everything and nothing. I mean, the monster is always combining things. Landscape. No, it's obvious. And in fact, I think, for example, the Atlan pole, which is a beautiful thing, super muscular, not the Hanscol of organism with all these things, in a way, its beauty, he said, I remember in those years, Hans Koloff was an amazing guy. He was super smart and was producing beautiful things. I don't know what has happened with him in the last years, but he was saying that the whole idea of the Atlan pole was to retire from the city, to go to the other side of the river. I think it was located in Nantes, in France, the project, and to create a kind of otherness, a replica of the city that was other city, and that was really enjoying the landscape and forming part of the landscape. Well, this is an example.
Any last questions from the students or anybody up there? Yes. Okay. Well, he's not a student, but he can ask a question. Yeah. Please go ahead. Yeah. Can you wait for the mic, please?
Could you comment on postmodern capitalism from the point of view of monsters like the CCTV tower or the World Trade Center or some of the globalization styles, which are sort of the ultimate consolidation of power, which used to be a function of the church, but now is a function of capital?
Well, you have a president now that could speak very well about this topic. Yeah, I mean, all my interest in the mixed use comes from the commercial mixed use. So I'm not ambiguous about that. I think that we live in a society that is driven by money and that it produces very consistent things, very consistent and very disastrous things. No? And so we have to negotiate with it. And I learn a lot from commercial buildings. The tower and office is basically about commercial buildings. I mean, commercial offices, etc., etc. And the pragmatism that you see in those buildings is something that you, in a way, have to interiorize if you want to survive in this world. I mean, as an architect, so there is a kind of lesson in that, or a technique in that I appreciate. Then there are the let's say the extremes, you know? And extreme capitalism is where we are going, which is dangerous. Everyone knows, but at the same time, it produces always a reaction, and we are seeing the reaction. We like it or not, we are seeing the reaction, the consequences of maximizing the differences, social differences. This is obvious. I mean, and in terms of wars and terrorism and other things. And so I think that these extreme manifestations of capitalism are how can I say, apocalyptic, in the sense that they announce not the best things that we should expect. So I prefer just to work with, let's say, the practices of the different societies that are in the market, to work with in terms of field of study, so case studies. But I'm not interested in these demonstrations of superpowers. I don't think they are interesting for an architect. This is my. They are interesting socially and in other terms, culturally, but and critically. But for me, are not interesting.
Iñaki, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. And for everything you've done.